She realized something had changed, not because anyone said a word, but because the chair was no longer where it had always been, and she stood there for a moment longer than usual, holding her bag with both hands, looking at the table, as if it were a room she had walked into by mistake. The dining room looked exactly the same as it always did. The light was still warm. The table was still set with the same plates, the same glasses, the same soft clinking sound of cutlery touching porcelain, and yet the space where she usually sat felt unfamiliar, as if it had quietly decided it no longer belonged to her. No one looked at her when she entered. They were already seated, leaning toward one another, voices low and comfortable, laughter soft enough to blend into the background. The kind of laughter that didn't need to be explained because it assumed everyone present was already included. She waited. She always waited a second before sitting, out of habit more than courtesy, because she had learned over time that waiting allowed her to read the room, to adjust herself to the mood of others, to make sure she wasn't interrupting something important just by existing in the space. But today, there was no clear place for her to go. The chair she used to sit on was no longer pulled back slightly, no longer angled toward the table in the way it always had been, and instead it was tucked neatly against the wall, pressed close to a side table that held nothing but a stack of folded napkins and a small decorative bowl no one ever used. It hadn't been moved carelessly. That was the part that stayed with her. The chair hadn't been shoved aside or left crooked or forgotten in a corner. It had been placed carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if someone had taken the time to decide where it should go and then made sure it looked intentional. She felt the heat rise in her face before she understood why. No one said her name. No one asked her to sit. Someone reached for the breadbasket and passed it down the table, hands brushing lightly as it moved from one person to the next, and the motion felt practiced, smooth, complete, as if the table had already decided how many people it needed to hold. She cleared her throat softly, not to speak, just to remind herself that she was still there, and the sound disappeared into the room without drawing a single glance. For a brief moment, she considered pulling the chair back herself and sitting down anyway, because technically, nothing was stopping her. The space was still open, the table wasn't full, and no one had said she couldn't. But something about the way the chair had been moved made her pause. It wasn't about the chair, it was about the decision behind it. She had learned, over years of paying attention, that there was a difference between being overlooked and being rearranged, between being forgotten and being quietly repositioned, and this felt like the latter. Subtle enough to deny, gentle enough to avoid confrontation, but clear enough to be felt. She set her bag down slowly, resting it against the wall, and stood there with her hands loosely clasped in front of her, listening to the conversation continue as if nothing had changed. They were talking about small things. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone else laughed about a story from earlier that day. The rhythm of the conversation didn't falter, didn't pause to adjust for her presence, didn't shift in tone the way it sometimes did when a new person joined. And that was when she understood that, in their minds, the room was already full. She told herself it was probably nothing. She told herself chairs get moved all the time, that spaces change, that people don't always notice these things the way she did, and that reading too much into small details was something she had been accused of before. Still, her feet didn't move. She stayed where she was standing, just far enough away to avoid blocking anyone close enough to hear every word without being invited into the exchange, and she wondered how long it would take before someone realized she hadn't sat down. Minutes passed. The plates were filled. The sound of forks scraping lightly against ceramic filled the room, steady and unremarkable, and she noticed that the chair by the wall remained empty, untouched, as if it had always belonged there. She reached for it slowly. The wood felt cool under her fingers, smoother than she remembered, and as she pulled it back, the legs made a soft sound against the floor, quiet enough not to interrupt the conversation but loud enough for her to hear it clearly. No one reacted. She hesitated again. If she sat down now, it would feel like forcing her way into a space that had already adjusted itself around her absence, and she didn't know which would feel worse, sitting where she was no longer expected or standing where she clearly wasn't noticed. She thought of all the times she had made space for others. The times she had shifted her own chair to let someone else sit more comfortably. The times she had stepped aside in hallways, lowered her voice in conversations, adjusted her schedule, her expectations, her needs, all in the quiet hope that consideration moved both ways. She pushed the chair back into place. She picked up her bag. No one asked where she was going. No one said her name. She walked out of the dining room slowly, her steps measured, her posture straight, because she had learned that leaving without being seen was easier if you didn't look like you were leaving at all. In the hallway, the light was cooler, the air quieter, and for a moment she just stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of the meal continuing behind the door, unchanged by her absence. She leaned her shoulder lightly against the wall and closed her eyes, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she needed a second to steady herself, to remind herself that she had not imagined what she felt. This wasn't about hurt, it was about recognition, about noticing when your place in a room shifts without discussion, when your presence becomes optional rather than assumed. when the space you once occupied is quietly repurposed without explanation. She straightened up and adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, smoothing her coat as if she were preparing to leave a public place rather than stepping away from something that used to feel familiar. She walked toward the front door. Outside, the air was cool and still, the kind of evening that made everything feel slightly more distant, and she stood on the porch for a moment longer than necessary, letting the door close behind her without making a sound. She didn't cry. She didn't feel angry. What she felt was a slow, heavy understanding settling into her chest, the kind that doesn't demand immediate reaction, but changes the way you see things moving forward. She realized that being moved aside rarely happens all at once. It happens in small adjustments, in chairs shifted quietly, in conversations that continue without pausing, in spaces that no longer wait for you to arrive. She walked down the steps and into the evening, her footsteps steady, her thoughts quiet, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most painful moments are the ones no one else notices at all. And behind her, inside the dining room, the empty chair remained where it had been placed, exactly where someone had decided it belonged.